Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm amazed that anyone invites me any place because I seem to be the patron of lost causes. And for years after Fast Food Nation came out, I'd be contacted by one labor union after another battling against a meatpacking company. I'd go to some little meatpacking town, and the labor union would be completely routed and decertified. That cloning hearing was unbelievable, and it was purely coincidental that that day I had a film crew with me, but they were able to film some of the most absurd arguments on behalf of not labeling cloned meat. And the bill actually passed the legislature and then was vetoed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who maybe is a little sensitive of criticism of clones. I don't quite understand. But anyway, I feel like in recent years, and not because of my presence, and maybe it's just coincidence, in recent years I feel like I'm involved in more winning battles. And having been engaged in food safety reform and in anti-obesity efforts and in pro-union efforts for more than a decade now, I'm beginning to see the tide turning and the good guys beginning to win these battles. And hopefully, with this FDA modernization bill that's now in the Senate, we'll win this big battle. But now I'm going to get to the speech that I prepared so that you all can not have to be here for too long. And I'm basically going to talk about food safety in America, some of the issues that we're facing, and some of the huge, huge problems. And these are solvable problems. I mean, not perfectly solvable, but when you look at intractable social problems, the spread of antibiotic-resistant staph and Salmonella infections, for example, is not an insolvable problem. And I guess I'd like to just start out by having kind of conjure an image for you guys. And the image would be, imagine that there was a factory somewhere. One who breathed it in. Imagine that that black cloud sickened 200,000 people a day. If that black cloud were visible and clearly sickening people, that factory would be shut down within a day. Unfortunately, the pollution of foodborne pathogens is invisible. And instead of there being one factory spewing out these contaminants, there are dozens of feedlots and processing plants that are basically vectors for the spread of disease. And these pathogens are invisible. It's very difficult to trace them back to their source, but the damage being done by a handful of industries is no different than if it was just one factory spewing out a black cloud. This year, more people will be killed by something they ate than all of the American soldiers killed in Iraq during the last 7 years. And every one of those deaths of one of our servicemen is a tragedy and deserves attention. But I think the deaths of people every day from people who are just eating food is equally important and deserving of attention. And as I said, this is an unnecessary problem and one that can be solved. So I just want to talk a little bit about what is the origin of this problem of adulterated, contaminated food. It's very simple, ultimately, in economic terms. It is cheaper and more profitable to sell adulterated food than it is to sell healthy, wholesome food. And that is based on the fundamental fact that when you have adulterated food and you have wholesome food, visually, in most cases, unless this one is just rotting and putrid, but in most cases, it's impossible for the consumer to tell the difference between the two. And this is an ancient problem. You can go back and read in ancient Rome of the adulteration of food products, and in the Middle Ages, and in 19th century England. When dishonest people are rewarded for being dishonest, it increases dishonesty. So if you look in our own country in the 19th century, in the absence of any food safety legislation, companies routinely sold fake butter, fake jams, adulterated milk, and children. What some people will do for money. Now, there was a big movement in the United States starting in the 1880s on behalf of pure food and safe food, but it really didn't get much traction until the publication in 1906 of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And The Jungle was written to describe the appalling conditions in the meatpacking plants for the workers, but it was the 20 or so pages describing how the food was being handled that really captured the public's attention. And Upton Sinclair wrote about meat being contaminated by rat droppings, by chemicals deliberately added to the meat to cover up the smell of the rancidity, and of old canned beef having the labels taken off and repackaged as new beef. 100 years ago, the beef trust, the beef industry controlled our government, bribed our politicians, bribed our newspapers, and routinely processed what the industry knows euphemistically as 4D animals. That is, animals that were dead, dying, diseased, or disabled. And because this was hidden from public view, they could do it on a daily basis. After the publication of The Jungle, and after our relatively conservative Republican President Theodore Roosevelt was willing to read a book written by an avowed socialist, he got on the case of food safety, and the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were passed. And these laws enshrined that the government had the obligation and the power to intervene on behalf of the public in cases where consumers could not tell the difference between, again, wholesome food and contaminated food. And we had a very diverse and competitive food system through the 1950s, through the 1960s, into the 1970s. Food safety was by no means ideal, but because there were so many diverse systems of production, there was nowhere near the same food safety problem that there is today. One of the things that happened, and I write about in Fast Food Nation, is the rise of gigantic, centralized, industrialized food production that made large-scale outbreaks much more likely. It used to be if you got meat and it was contaminated from a local butcher shop, the outbreak would be confined to the neighborhood that used that butcher shop. Today, ground beef is produced in enormous processing plants that can put out as much as 1 million pounds of ground beef a day. That meat is not only shipped within a state, it's shipped nationwide, even worldwide. And if there's a problem at one of those plants, there could be a huge problem. In the 1970s, we had thousands of slaughterhouses. Today, we have 13 slaughterhouses that produce the majority of beef consumed by 300 million Americans. And if there's a problem in one of those buildings, there can be an enormous problem. So oddly enough, as technology and industry, and engineering is being applied to our food system, it's actually become more dangerous, and the potential for huge outbreaks has become bigger, not smaller. Now, at the same time this industrialization and centralization was going on, we had another change. We had President Reagan take office and bring a new philosophy to government, which is that things are best when industry regulates itself. And the Reagan administration deliberately began cutting staffing levels at the FDA, which is responsible for most of our food, cutting staffing levels at the USDA, which is responsible for the safety of meat and poultry products. And the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, continued this trend. And the USDA and the FDA essentially became captured regulatory agencies. Agencies staffed by industry representatives, and agencies very much serving private interests and not the public interest. Now, the National Academy of Sciences, through the Institute of Medicine, warned in 1985 that our food safety system was obsolete and needed science-based techniques such as testing for dangerous pathogens, and that disasters our meat supply, and it wasn't until 1993 when we had a large-scale outbreak at Jack in the Box, which hundreds of children were sickened. So that's the origins of the problem. Changes in the production system, combined with changes in the attitude of the role of government, created a perfect environment for many, many people to become sickened. So what's the problem today? Well, the problem today is that an estimated 76 million Americans are sickened by something they eat every year. 76 million. That's basically 1 out of 4. Look around the room. 1 out of 4 of you, statistically, are likely to become ill. Now, this isn't totally a representative sample, and I don't want to insult anyone of who gets sick. What's tragic is the population most likely to get sick are small children. And for most pathogens, except for Listeria, it's children under the age of 4. The other vulnerable populations are seniors and people who are immunosuppressed. We are talking about a social problem that affects the weakest and most vulnerable people in our society. And what is the cost of this in dollar value? Because that seems to be something that the politicians here may pay attention to. Well, a recent study at Georgetown University, sponsored by the Pew Charitable Trust, came up with a figure of $152 billion a year is the cost of 1 out of every 4 Americans being sickened by food-borne illness. And you've got to keep in mind that there's about more than 250,000 are hospitalized every year because of something they ate. Now, we have a wonderful anti-obesity effort at the moment, and obesity is a huge problem, and I've been involved in anti-obesity efforts for a decade. The estimated cost of obesity per year in the United States is $147 billion. So they're roughly the same. They're also finding, and Barb Kowalczyk, who I think is in the room today, is leading some of the research on this, that there are long-term implications of many of these foodborne illnesses. I mean, most of us think about being violently ill for a few days, perhaps being hospitalized, but they're now finding that with some pathogens like Salmonella, there may be lifelong health complications from one single infection that last for many years after the stomach problems are gone. And with Salmonella, we're talking about small children who are the most vulnerable and may have, reactive arthritis, in some cases may have irritable bowel for the rest of their lives because of something they ate as a toddler. These problems are getting bigger and bigger. In 2008, we had one of the largest recalls of contaminated meat, which was the Westland Hallmark ground beef recall. 145 million pounds of contaminated ground beef. If you think about a typical fast food hamburger being 1/4 of a pound, I mean, that's almost enough for 2 hamburgers for every American. Tainted. Last year, we had one of the most despicable foodborne outbreak in recent memory, which involved peanut butter. Peanut butter, a food routinely consumed by small children. And the Peanut Corporation of America was responsible for an estimated 22,000 illnesses with Salmonella in 46 states and 9 deaths. And this was an aging plant shipping contaminated peanut butter for months. The factory was filled, you read the reports, the factory was filled with mouse droppings, dead mice. There was mold growing on the walls of the cooler. Roasted nuts were stored right next to raw nuts that were contaminated with Salmonella. The roasting ovens were not calibrated so that they could guarantee that they would kill the pathogen. And the company stopped using a testing facility because the tests kept on coming back positive for Salmonella. And because they were coming back positive from Salmonella, they found a new testing company, or they would send the tests back of these samples to be retested until they were negative. The evidence is pretty strong that this company, for months, knowingly sold peanut butter that was contaminated. And this, pardon me? I'm sorry, I thought someone said something. It boggles the mind, and I've been in this field for more than a decade now, and one of the worst stories, one of the most incredible stories, involves our own government being involved in the purchase of very questionable product. USA Today did an investigation last year that found that the USDA and our own agricultural marketing service had bought more than 70 million pounds of spent hen meat. Now, spent hen meat are from egg-laying hens that are so old and so decrepit, something has to be done with them. And traditionally, what's been done with spent hens is they've been rendered into pet food or they've been rendered into compost. Well, the USDA came up with a brilliant idea. They would buy all this meat from the egg producers, and what would they do with it? They would serve it to the nation's school children. Now, this is meat that Campbell's Soup and McDonald's and KFC refuses to buy. This is meat that is more likely than any other poultry to be riddled with different pathogens because these hens are in terrible shape and quite sick by the time that they're dead. And in 2006, our own government agency purchased 1/3 of the spent hen meat in the United States to serve to school children. And I wouldn't mind if they bought it and they served it to American pets, but basically our school lunch program had become a means of subsidizing the industry and buying the meat that no one else really wanted to buy. Another threat to our food system right now comes from chemicals that are routinely being used in food production. And the President's Cancer Report panel came up with an amazing report recently that was issued that talked about the threat of the roughly 80,000 chemicals that are being let loose, the man-made chemicals let loose into our environment. And of those 80,000, only a few hundred have ever been tested for their safety. And I'm going to read you a quote from the President's Cancer Panel report, which came out about a couple of months ago. Quote, I'm talking about the dangers of pesticides and pesticide residues in our food. We have sprayed pesticides which are inherent poisons throughout our shared environment. They are now in amniotic fluid. They're in our blood. They're in our urine. They're in our exhaled breath. They're in our mother's milk. What is the burden of cancer that we can attribute to this use of poisons throughout our agricultural system? We won't really know that answer until we do another experiment, which is to take the poisons out of our food chain, embrace a different kind of agriculture, a healthier agriculture, and see what happens. So we not only have this domestic threat, but we now have a growing global threat as increasingly food is imported into the United States. And particularly one of my main concerns is food that's being imported from China. In the last decade, our imports from China have increased fivefold, and China is now the third leading exporter of food to the United States. And let me give you a sense of what's going on in China in the same years that we began to import their food on a large scale. In 2003, spinach from China was found in Japan to have pesticide residues 180 times the healthy limit. In 2003, ham laced with toxic chemicals as preservatives were found. In 2004, half a dozen deaths were linked in China to beverages made out of a mix of industrial alcohol and rice wine. In 2004, companies were caught using lead-based whiteners to vermicelli pasta to make it look white. Another company was caught using toxic industrial bleach to make pasta look white. In 2005, a cancer-causing fungal agent called malachite green was found in Chinese processed food, seafood items, again, shipped to Japan, South Korea. In 2007, we had the huge scandal of wheat gluten shipped to the United States from China, contaminated with melamine that killed American pets. Melamine is a cheap coal derivative that mimics protein when you test for it. And that melamine, I'm having a problem pronouncing it. That melamine was not only sold for our pet food, but also was sold and used as animal feed in the United States and fed to our hogs and chickens. In one of the worst outbreaks in 2008, 300,000 infants in China were sickened by tainted infant formula, deliberately tainted infant formula, and 50,000 infants were hospitalized. That same year, Chinese dumplings that were riddled with toxic pesticides sickened people in Japan. Last year, dozens of people were sickened by ham tainted with clenbuterol, an asthma medication that was given to the hogs simply because it made their meat leaner. And this year, toxic chemicals were found in snow peas from Japan because the toxic chemicals made them greener and made them seem like the peas within the snow peas seem like the more valuable green peas. In the United States this year, honey from China has been found tainted with dangerous levels of antibiotics. Now, what's behind this is a get-rich-quick mentality at any cost, enormous amounts of official corruption in China. There are over 200 million farmers, so it's very hard to regulate what's going on in their farms. There's very little regulation on how they can use pesticides or antibiotics. The farms tend to be near industrial areas, so there's high levels of heavy metal contamination of the fields. This is a problem, and it's a problem because this food is coming into the United States largely untested. And right now, 60% of the apple juice consumed in the United States is coming from China. And that juice is the basis of all these juice drinks that children in the United States are routinely consuming. And enormous amounts of seafood are now coming into the United States from China, almost entirely untested. We now have a global food system. And I'm going to read you one other quote. This came from a National Academy of Sciences report recently that took even mundane food items you would never think would contain imported items now do. Here's a quote, and it's actually from the Grocery Manufacturers Manufacturers Association, who normally fights against food safety, but I think this is a pretty good example. Quote, "As an example of how globalization is changing our view of what food is, consider a loaf of bread that has the label made in the USA, but which is comprised of ingredients, 7 ingredients, for example, that could have come from all over the world. 1. Wheat gluten in the bread from France, Poland, Russia, the Netherlands, or Australia. 2. Honey in the bread from China, Vietnam, Brazil, Uruguay, India, Canada, Mexico, or Argentina. 3. Calcium propionate in the bread from the Netherlands. 4. Guar gum from India. 5. Flour enrichment from China. 6. Beta-carotene from Switzerland. 7. Vitamin D3 from China. All in one loaf of bread. You could easily have more than ingredients from more than half a dozen countries. A typical fast food hamburger can contain ground beef from as many as 5 different countries. So we now have a centralization of production. We have globalization of source material. We have potential for all kinds of new outbreaks. So what do we do about this? Well, the reform of the Food and Drug Administration is absolutely essential because it is responsible for the food safety of 80% of the food that we eat. And right now, that agency does not have the power to recall contaminated meat, does not have the power to trace contaminated food, does not have the power to test for it, and is essentially toothless. More than half of the U.S. food processing facilities have gone 5 years without ever being visited by the FDA. And during the last Bush administration, the number of FDA inspections declined. A 2009 study by the FDA's own Inspector General found that of 40 food products, the FDA had no ability to trace back the ingredients of 35. 35 out of 40, they had no idea where the stuff came from. And 60% roughly of the facilities processing food were not in compliance with any kind of FDA record keeping that might help trace where their ingredients came from. Again, this is a disaster waiting to happen. The FDA modernization bill that is stuck in the Senate will increase inspections, require processors to identify potential risks, and require imported food to meet the same standards as that produced in the United States. It will enable testing of the food for dangerous pathogens, and it will give the FDA the power to order the recall, a mandatory recall of contaminated products. Right now, there are 12 federal agencies that have oversight of food safety, and there's very little coordination between them. And there are absurd conflicts in which, for example, if a frozen pizza has pepperoni on it, the USDA is responsible for its food safety, and if it's just a cheese pizza, it's the FDA. And there are constant, absurd examples like that. We also need to phase out very quickly the overuse of antibiotics for growth promotion in livestock. It's absolutely absurd. Antibiotics that human beings cannot obtain over the counter at a pharmacy, farmers can just go to the feed store and buy in massive amounts. In Denmark, antimicrobials can only be used when animals are sick and only with prescription from a veterinarian. And we have in this country horrible antibiotic-resistant pathogens that are totally linked to these factory farms and pose a real danger. The methicillin-resistant staph infections are horrible, and again, largely striking children and can kill them. And in Denmark, when they really cut down on antibiotic use, they saw an enormous decline in antibiotic-resistant drugs in human beings. It's just incredible. And Denmark offers an example in many ways about how to do this differently. They've gotten rid of these antibiotic-resistant strains that are affecting humans, and the increased cost it adds in the hog industry, it adds an additional 32 cents per animal not to be overtreating them with antibiotics. In this country right now, an estimated 30 to 70,000 people are dying every year because of antibiotic-resistant bugs. This is a totally solvable problem, and some of our most valuable medicines are being rendered useless by the desire of industry just to have their poultry and their hogs grow a little faster. Pathogen control is also possible, and I keep on coming back to Denmark. Denmark is one of the world's leading exporters of meat. They have a huge hog industry. They are by far the biggest exporter of pork. And in Denmark, they found that there was a real problem with Salmonella being spread in the 1980s by poultry, in the 90s by hogs, and in the late 1990s by eggs. So they came up with a very strict Salmonella control program. They also found, once they did this, a huge decrease in the Salmonella in the human population. Per 100,000, I'll just give you some statistics and then I'll move on from this. Per 100,000, in 1998, the number of human illnesses linked to poultry Salmonella was 30.8 per 100,000. 20 years later, that had fallen to 0.3 per 100,000. The number of Salmonella cases caused by pork had been 22 per 100,000. That had fallen to 2.0 per 100,000. And the rate of Salmonella caused by eggs in the human population had gone from 57.7 down to 3.3. These are extraordinary drops in Salmonella infection within a decade or so, simply by strict enforcement on the farm and in processing. So how are we handling that same problem in the United States? Well, about 1.5 million Americans are sickened by Salmonella every year. There is a new nasty form of antibiotic-resistant Salmonella that's being spread by ground beef. And what is the USDA rule on Salmonella? It is perfectly legal to sell ground beef in the United States that is completely riddled with Salmonella, because our government has decided that Salmonella is a naturally occurring organism, and therefore it is not an adulterant of ground beef. Now, the Salmonella in ground beef comes from something else that's naturally occurring, manure. And it's the contamination of our meat by manure that's put the salmonella there. And the consumer who goes to the supermarket to buy ground beef has no way of knowing which ground beef is riddled with high loads of salmonella and which ground beef would be safe to purchase. So you have two completely different approaches by one government and another. And the meatpacking industry's line in this country, their argument is the same argument that they made in 1906 when they were fighting against the Meat Inspection Act. Just cook it. It's the consumer's responsibility to deal with the contamination. And, you know, in Denmark, they put the responsibility on the polluters not to be polluting their food system. Now, the meatpacking companies and the food processing companies in this country are not evil, but they're operating from a very different point of view. They don't want their customers to get sick, but they also don't want to be held legally responsible when they do get sick. So they don't want traceability, they don't want testing, they don't want automatic recall and mandatory recall, because that will hold them legally responsible for what they're doing. A very good food safety system in this country would not be very expensive. I mentioned in terms of hogs, it would be an extra 32 cents per animal to get rid of the antibiotic use. In terms of ground beef, a very good pathogen testing system like the kind that Jack in the Box has costs an additional 1 penny per pound of ground beef. We can afford to do this. So limits should be placed on the amounts of pathogens that our food can contain, and above all, our food safety system should be governed by common sense. Companies that produce contaminated food shouldn't be permitted to sell it, and companies that are selling wholesome food should be rewarded for doing so. And it's amazing to me that this FDA bill is stuck, because this food safety issue isn't like abortion. It's not like gun control. It's not as though there are passionate advocates in this country of contaminated meat. You know, we want salmonella, and I mean, you know, the Tea Party has embraced some kind of bizarre positions, but I've never seen Tea Partiers campaigning on behalf of antibiotic-resistant, you know, salmonella. Yeah. So, most importantly, we need a single, strong, central food safety agency that can coordinate, you know, looking at our food safety system from the farm to the retail establishments. And this is something, again, that the National Academy of Sciences has been calling for years. We need, quite simply, to be able to test and trace and recall. And our food will never, ever be perfectly safe. There is nothing in life that is perfectly safe. But it's outrageous how many children are being sickened every single day unnecessarily. And I'm going to end by quoting John F. Kennedy, who really was a supporter of the modern consumer movement. And in his special message to Congress in March of 1962, I think it's relevant to all of you at the Consumers Union and all of you who are activists, he laid out what the fundamentals of a consumers movement should be. And that is basic rights that our citizens should have. Quote, the right to safety, that is, to be protected against the marketing of goods that are dangerous or hazardous to our health. 2, the right to be informed, that is, to be protected against false or misleading advertising and information, but also the right to have adequate labeling of products so that consumers are given the information to make informed decisions about their purchases. And 3, the right to choose. Because without adequate labeling, without adequate information, there is no choice. There is no meaningful choice, and you're basically being forced to buy what these companies want you to buy. The right to safety, the right to information, the right to choice, we have none of these in a meaningful way right now with our food supply. We deserve and must have all of them. And I would add one more thing to this before wrapping up. Safe and healthy food is not and should not be a privilege. It should be a fundamental right. And I hope that all of you in your own communities, and also while you're here in D.C., will really do something so that we get that right. Thank you.
Before we have to get Eric to a cab to the airport or to the White House, it's on the White House. It's on. And so we will come around. Well, does it work?
Yep, we got it.
Children for school lunches. I was glad that you pointed out that took place in 2006. And I think when we all look at these specific issues of one consumer element or another, it's extremely important to keep in the back of our minds that the Tea Party folks you mentioned don't talk about healthy food or salmonella. They talk about liberty, the free market, government regulation is terrible, there should be none of it. They're libertarians of the far right. So they conduct their discourse on the level, kind of like the NRA. Guns are in the Constitution. It's absolute. And I think, anyway, everyone here realizes that government regulation is what's made our civilization what it has been at the best. So when everyone leaves this meeting, keep in mind that elections are coming up, that there is a difference between candidates and parties, and please don't fail to vote. Otherwise, we'll have another administration like the one that sold spent chickens to school children.
Very interesting talk, thank you. You hit on a lot of key issues with food problems. I'm wondering if you've started to think about a way to control salt. Britain and other civilized countries in the world have been doing this for 5 to 10 years and have had good success with controlling salt. But I would argue that it's a very subtle poison in our food and that it probably affects and kills more Americans early than even the infectious agents and so on. Are you beginning to think about that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think people much more important than me are really thinking about it. I think that Mayor Bloomberg has a real initiative to reduce salt. I think the FDA is looking at that. And, you know, the ugly truth is that salt is put in there for the same reason that companies that have been adulterating food for 100 years put things in. Salt is cheap, and it's cheaper than other flavor additives that are more expensive. And it's a way of selling an inferior product that tastes as though it were a better product. And it's absolutely, I mean, we need salt to survive, but we don't need anywhere near the amount that's just deliberately being put into processed foods so that they don't have to spend more for, you know, less for more expensive ingredients.
Again, thank you for coming and giving us all of the facts, all of the information that you gave us today, Eric. I remember when I was in high school and I read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and I just stopped eating meat right then, bologna, hot dogs, and all of that. Somehow when I got to college, I had to eat whatever, you know, was there. But that is another great book. If you all have never read it, pick it up, read that. And I too hope that when everyone leaves this summit, that you would go back and start to inform others around you about food safety. Again, the whole school system and the things that are fed to our children it sickens me. If you don't have kids, you know, you might not think, you know, like some of us that have kids, but the way that our kids are treated as if they're not even human. Yeah, they're young, they're little people, but they are people. They have feelings, they have emotions, and things of that matter too. So I would hope that you all would take this information and share it with whomever you come in contact with. Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you hit on something that I've been noticing a lot lately, which is our trade policy. In terms of our food safety laws and our inability to keep bad food from other countries that we know do not have good standards out. Often we have these free trade agreements that, you know, we don't have a right to keep it out because we don't want them to keep our food out. Just an example you brought up was honey. In 2002, I was working in England, and the EU at that point already banned Chinese honey. Here, we do not ban it, and also there was an expose done that a lot of honey is kind of smuggled in through various routes so that it's really Chinese and it's marked that it's from somewhere else. So I think that's something that we, you know, those of us who are food activists, not trade activists. But I was wondering if you're doing anything on that.
You know, what you see me doing right now is really all I'm doing. I mean, I'm trying to be useful as an activist, but as a writer, I'm writing about nuclear weapons next. Another really cheerful subject. But I think you're absolutely right that there is an enormous effort by these companies to create trade agreements that trump domestic legislation. And these bigger, you know, WTO type trade agreements and some of the EU agreements don't empower governments to have tougher food safety laws because they're governed by this notion of the free market and free trade. And I'm always amused when these free marketeers talk about, you know, their philosophy of food safety because, you know, the farmers of this country are subsidized to a degree that's just extraordinary, and the USDA basically exists to subsidize them. I mean, the products being bought for our school lunch program aren't being bought according to criteria of what's best for children. They're being bought according to which farmers and which producers and processors do we want to essentially give a handout to, like the spent hen thing. So in the name, school, I mean, it's like dumping whatever surplus on our kids. So, you know, these trade agreements are done and justified by free trade, and, you know, there's nothing like free trade, free market principles operating in this country. It's more like socialism, but a weird corporate version of it.
So this is, we have time for one more question, so hopefully someone we haven't heard from yet.
You commented on choice, and the lady here commented on trade. Now, one of the attractions of the imports from China is the cheapness and the low price. But then there's the issue of currency manipulation. And the currency manipulation is allowing China to hollow out a lot of industries around the world. So once they have monopolies in these industries, like they do in some vitamins, several years ago they raised the prices. Won't the equation just be like the perfect storm in that we have all the quality issues and all the safety issues, and then we have higher prices because they've accumulated a monopoly?
Yeah. You know, I don't know that they'll be able, I think you're absolutely right in terms of their currency manipulation. I don't know that they'll be able to get a monopoly on certain ingredients maybe, but my concern with, for example, apple juice isn't necessarily that we won't ever be able to produce our own apples. It's that the Washington State apple, growers who try to do a very good job are being wiped out by a foreign competitor that isn't applying anywhere near the same standards. And one of the central arguments of the book Fast Food Nation that I wrote is the cheapness of this food is illusory. And if you add in all the other social costs, it's very, very expensive. But what companies within the United States have managed to do, and what China is managing to do, is impose their business costs on us. tainted products that make people sick impose a cost. And if the cheap hamburger may be cheap when you buy it, but when you have the dialysis as a result of eating it, it's actually a really expensive burger. So I think, I think with certain manufactured items, absolutely, China is gaining a monopoly. I mean, it's amazing how many things that we use every day that we no longer can make because the cheap labor in China and the currency differential has just made it so much more advantageous in the short term to make things there.
Thank you, Eric, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for being useful.